Okay, good morning and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks again for joining us on the BI Washington Policy Pulse. We were off last week. My family and I were actually down in Charleston, South Carolina for 48 hours until Tropical Storm Debbie pushed us out of the way. So then we went to Asheville, North Carolina, just for a couple of days to rest and relax. But we are back at it. And so Justin Tracy is joining me today from the team. He wants to talk a little bit about some AI legislation that came out before Congress left for the August recess. But I thought it'd be important today just to talk a little bit more about Governor Tim Walz and the implications of a vice presidency if Kamala Harris wins in November. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because last week my colleagues, led by Jennifer Rhee, put out a great note talking specifically about this this case or this. Let me go ahead and make sure if you can see my screen. I think I'm showing the wrong screen here, so let me go ahead and stop that. 1 second. Okay. So, Justin, can you confirm that you can see the Tim Walz deck?
I can, Nathan. Looks great.
Okay, great. Thank you. So Governor Walz, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, at a high level, this is a very fascinating pick because I think as everybody was aware, he wasn't one of the front runners. If you looked at the predicted markets, a lot of this was dovetailing on, Senator Mark Kelly or, Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro. And it wasn't until late in the game that Governor Walz came in as a potential pick. Now, one of the first questions we got was, well, how does a person get the endorsement from AOC, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, at the same time of getting the endorsement of Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia? You have a very progressive representative from New York City also getting the same endorsement as a very conservative Democrat from the state of West Virginia. And, we looked at Governor Walz, we looked at the policies, and we ultimately think that this supports Kamala Harris and supports our narrative towards a Harris presidency in terms of progressive in some areas, moderate in other areas. Now, let me just preface by saying that, this all depends on whether or not Kamala Harris, if she wins, provides Governor Walz the ability to go out and actually lead policy. Vice presidents usually don't matter all that much when it comes to policies and so forth like that, unless the president defers that type of power. Think of George W. Bush with Dick Cheney. There was a lot of power there on national security and defense that Dick Cheney had. And, he wasn't actually the one in Congress voting for these measures, but he was also he was one of the gentlemen in the White House who was actually developing policy. So this all just presumes that Governor Walz is deferred that power. Now, when I said before that it was progressive in some areas, moderate or in other areas, I think it's really the financial regulation piece is really a good way to point it out. So, when let's just say that if Governor Walz was given this authority, we think that he would focus more on consumer and protection issues for the individual as opposed to more moderate measures for corporates. Now, what I mean by that is that really the Basel III endgame is, I think, a good sample of that. So the Basel III endgame came out from the Fed, the FDIC, and the OCC. The first proposal of the Basel III endgame said, okay, capital requirements are going to increase by 19% for the big banks, 5 to 6% for the mid-sized banks. Now, you didn't have to be let me rephrase it this way. When that came out, it was very difficult for the Fed to actually keep that view up because of the same breath. If you looked at the stress tests that have come out this year, the banks are pretty well capitalized. And so a lot of moderate Democrats were going back to the Fed and saying, wait, how can you actually increase capital requirements 19% when you're saying that the banks are already well capitalized? And we think that this type of thinking would continue under a Harris or Walz presidency, where they will still move forward with rules like the Basel III endgame, but instead of that 19% capital requirement increase, you're going to get something that the banks would call more reasonable. 3, 5, 6%. Our base assumption for that is 7 to 10%, but somewhere around there we think would be more moderate in tone. The difference, though, is that if you look at policies at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau or the Federal Trade Commission, aka what Rohit Chopra is doing at the CFPB or what Lena Khan is doing at the FTC, that could be more on the progressive side. Now, this is more about consumer protection, disclosures, so forth, but it could even bleed into a little bit of this economic populism, if you will, that's very similar to what we're seeing from the J.D. Vance side of the Republican Party. So I think they're going to pick and choose. It's not so much simplistic to say that Governor Walz means this. I think it's more so we're going to have to actually see ultimately what power he is given, and then secondly, what does he want to do? Our colleague Rob Barnett wrote about how the carbon goals would be backed by Governor Walz, Walz as governor and as vice president. You could see a continuation of Inflation Reduction Act type policies. This would be good for solar companies like First Solar and Enphase and so forth like that. My colleague Holly Fromm, same type of narrative in terms of pro EV pushes. So, in fact, when his administration in Minnesota adopted a rule that imposed California's stricter tailpipe emission standards, one of the first states in the Midwest to do so, and especially, in Midwest, given the Michigan auto industry, that could be something to pay attention to. My colleague Dwayne Wright wrote about healthcare, essentially how he backed a public health insurance option in Minnesota. So again, it's a very continuation of the type of policies that we're seeing. However, Justin can bring this up if he wants, after this. Justin and Jennifer Reed wrote how he would support most likely a more moderate position on antitrust enforcement than the current administration. So this is very indicative of ultimately what you should think of if Governor Walz is the one who's actually deferred this policy, that they defer the policies to progressives in some areas, moderate in other areas. So before I turn it over to Justin, just a couple other things to keep in mind. There are two speeches coming up this week that are certainly interesting to watch. President Trump and Vice President Kamala Harris will be down in North Carolina. Both of them will be doing speeches that are geared towards the economy. So we're going to be paying attention to those in particular. I think President Trump is scheduled to speak on Wednesday, and I think Vice President Harris is scheduled to speak on Friday. So if you're interested in economic matters or just general, the state of the economy and so forth, certainly pay attention to that one. And also just remember, next week starts the convention in Chicago, the Democratic National Convention. So we'll talk a little bit more about that next week. But with that, I'm going to turn it now over to Justin, see if, Justin, if you want to talk a little bit about AI.
Sure. Thanks, Nathan. So, yeah, no surprise here. AI is really the flavor of the month, of the year, I think, in many circles. I think, it's obvious you can't really get through a broadcast, much less a conversation lately, without hearing a little bit about AI. But what we're tracking over here now is legislation related to AI pricing algorithms. And what this is, it's different from the whole surveillance pricing issue that kind of was talked about a couple of weeks ago with the FTC possibly looking into that. Surveillance pricing kind of looks at your own behavior as a consumer and says, what are you looking at? What are you searching for? What do you really want to buy, right? And maybe modifies the price that's offered to a particular consumer based on what they're actually looking at in their searches. How that differs from what we're looking at here from an antitrust perspective are these AI pricing algorithms where what's happening is competitors are actually sharing non-public data with one another through a third party to develop pricing that might be disfavorable to a consumer. How does that work? So what we're seeing, at least for now, is this issue kind of concentrated between the residential rental market for apartments, things like that, and then also a situation for hotel rates. And what we're seeing is where these third-party providers with an algorithm, what they're doing is receiving information not only about how much those rents or rates are set at, but future occupancy rates and past occupancy rates for different times of the year, if you will. So they put together this kind of soup, and from that they're able to give prices that are advantageous to them, but based on information that's not available generally to the public. So what's happening in Congress on this? So there are two bills right now. We think they're probably both dead on arrival this year, unfortunately. With a 20% chance of passing, I think that's probably even generous. They're both Senate bills. One is focused on just the residential rental market, right? So banning this practice in that market. The other is broader and looks at the use of these algorithms across all industries and would basically create a per se or a presumption of a per se violation of antitrust laws if those are being used with using this non-public competitor data. So Senator Wyden is carrying the bill on the residential market, Senator Klobuchar carrying the bill, a broader bill. Again, no House version for either, and even though there's been a hearing on these issues back last December, haven't really seen any activity from Congress. So why are we discussing this from a policy perspective? Well, what's happening here, as with so many other issues, is that where Congress has been kind of inactive on it, the states and municipalities have really taken the lead on stepping in. And what we're seeing now is San Francisco, for example, as a municipality, is discussing moving forward with a ban on these algorithms, at least in the context of residential rents. So we think maybe if that starts happening there, that's a practice that could expand to other states and municipalities, and we start seeing a patchwork develop as to whether or not these algorithms are allowed to continue. What's also happening is from a litigation standpoint, that's where we're seeing some action. Again, where Congress isn't really stepping up to the plate to address the situation. We're seeing some suits being brought by states' attorneys general. Arizona and DC have already brought suits to ban the use of these algorithms in the residential rental context. We're also seeing a private class action now against RealPage, which is the third-party platform that these residential managers are using to offer these kind of collaborative rents, if you will, to the public. So the DOJ has also filed a statement of interest in that case, the private class action, where they're supporting the case theory that's there. So even though there hasn't been legislation that's been passed, there's not a new law on the books, what we're seeing is trying to use existing law to stop this practice wherever that's possible. And then lastly, we're also seeing a private case right now with these hotel companies. The one that we think probably is going to be able to move forward, at least for the time being, is this case involving Atlantic City casinos. And why would that be the place where that's happening? Well, it's a really small, easily defined, relevant market, right? So there's only a handful of those upscale casinos in Atlantic City. And what plaintiffs there are saying is that, look, if you look at the folks who actually used this algorithm versus the one or two others who didn't, what you can see is that the prices are all correlated between the people who use that technology, and the folks who didn't use it are way out of whack with everyone else as to what they were offering as rents to the public. So there, DOJ has also filed a statement of interest. We think that probably beats a motion to dismiss. And unless Congress kind of steps up to the plate here, we think litigation in the states are where the actual, developments will probably happen with this. Democrats win back both chambers in the White House in the fall. Likely we see a little bit of action, but in absence of that, probably still continuing to be stalled in Congress. So that's the lay of the land with that, Nathan.
So I got one question for you. Do you have to
Yeah.
go to Atlantic City to conduct research? And if so, can I come with?
Yeah, absolutely. I hope we do. Definitely might have to see if this is also at stake at the poker table. So sounds like a plan.
Great. So thank you, Justin. So just last
Sure.
thing I want to remind folks is that tomorrow at 10 a.m. Eastern, I'm going to be joining our utility and renewable analysts, both in the U.S. and the EU, to do a webinar about the Inflation Reduction Act and essentially all the clean energy tax credits. So if you want to invite to that, please reach out to me. I'll send that over to you. Again, my email is at ndean10@bloomberg.net. So I want to say thank you again for joining, and we'll talk to you again next week. Thank you.